Okay, hi everybody. So for our final projects, the trauma intervention that I chose was healing through service and critical consciousness and critical action. And I kind of want to lump them all into service, but they are different components of this healing intervention. So the trauma that I'm going to be focusing on is racism or anti-blackness induced trauma, and we have a definition of that there. It says racial trauma, also referred to as race-based traumatic stress, is the psychological, emotional, and physical injury from experiencing real and perceived of racism. And of course, these are tied to lived experiences due to an individual belonging to a racialized category or racialized group. Here are some different forms of racism to be aware of. Overt racism involves slurs, de facto racism, which meaning a type of racism that is built and embedded into the social consciousness of that society and is kind of like second nature and practice is second nature. Genocidal practices, hate crimes, calls for violence against racial groups. And then some examples of covert racism would include discriminatory policies and practices, exclusion on the basis of race, brutality, violence, and the violences could include mental, physical, psychological, or emotional, harassment or indifference and neglect of a person's cultural identity or race. And these examples are not like all of the examples that could possibly fall under overt and covert racism. They are just some more prevalent examples. One thing I wanted to say about covert racism is that it stems from implicit bias and unconscious biases. And so while overt slurs and calls for violence are not apparent, or maybe intentions are not always apparent, they are a combination and accumulation of different microaggressions and macroaggressions that hinder a racialized group's ability to advance or to live their lives full of joy, liberation, and free from mental, physical, and psychological, emotional warfare on the part of their racialized identity. Hey, so I want to briefly talk about some of the effects and the healing pathways, possible healing pathways for anti-blackness induced trauma. So the effects are that sufferers can be seen with PTSD from cumulative incidents of discrimination, and these are heightened by repeated exposure to those multiple forms of discrimination in the media. So videos, pictures of brutality, or videos of discrimination on the basis of race, and those being repeated in the media or on social media or in the news can also heighten the effects of PTSD and heighten the trauma. Traumatic reactions include depression, anxiety, dissociation, sleep disturbance. There can also be negative psychological development changes, as we talked about earlier in the semester with ACEs. You can also experience high stress levels, higher than others, and those can lead to a higher likelihood of negative health outcomes for Black people, which there's been extensive research about the disparities in healthcare, and as well as the disparities in health outcomes that seem to be unexplained by simply skin color. And so many psychologists have attempted to explain it through lived experiences like anti-blackness. And some healing pathways include prevention through protest and resistance. And so resisting these forms of oppression that are being imposed on your identity or on your lived experience. Pursuit of social justice, so that these occurrences don't hinder progress, don't hinder ability to, again, live a life of liberation and joy. Service-oriented actions and community engagement, so really digging deep with the community, figuring out the needs of the community, assessing them and being a part of the change. And one huge aspect of this healing is finding your role in the community as well. Like everybody's good at different things, and so finding the thing that you're good at that serves the community in ways that allows for progress. Cumulative interventions, these could be social, political, psychological, involving therapy. And the last one is collective consciousness and healing spaces with and for sufferers of anti-Black racism. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that could possibly look like later. In one of the articles that we discussed last week, in which I cited at the end of the presentation, Mosley talks about a prevalent pathway of processing anti-Black racism, and it follows through with witnessing and experiencing it, and then processing it in a critical way, as well as processing it with others, and then acting critically against this anti-Black racist oppression. And now we can dig into the the pathways a little bit deeper. So with critical consciousness, there is an intentional analysis and development of intersectional activism, and this is after the events have been witnessed and processed, and they can also be seen as Mosley says in the article, prerequisites of liberation and resistance. Okay, so it's building that sort of stamina and understanding that these lived experiences are a form of oppression, and developing that consciousness about what exactly to do about them. And then moving into service, this could be community organizing and engagement and intentional development of solutions to racial injustice. And that doesn't just look like gathering and protesting. It also looks like providing the needs of that community in whatever way, shape, or form possible, or advocating for the needs of that community. And that could look like protest demonstrations, etc., but also political grassroots work. And one more aspect of service can be creating spaces for people who are sufferers of anti-Blackness, creating ally organizations, and healing spaces and affinity spaces. Those are all services because they provide a means for other people to also process and heal through anti-Black racism and racial-induced trauma. And the last one is critical action, and this would involve the behavioral manifestations of that consciousness. And so it would look like activism, mentoring, outreach, education, just essentially spreading awareness about the necessity of liberation for Black people. And all of those are healing pathways because they help the sufferer helps them to contextualize their trauma, and instead of engaging in like a fight, flight, or freeze response just as a means of survival or consistently being in a survival mode, they can refocus, re-energize, and redirect some of the emotions that stem from the trauma or some of their traumatic reactions into service, which then could manifest into healing and more positive outcomes for interpersonal well-being, for personal well-being, and for communal well-being. And I want to kind of make some connections between this form of healing and intervention and some of the things we talked about in class. So we definitely talked about how ways to pull it together a few weeks ago, and we talked about this thing called synaptogenesis, in which traumatic experiences are being met with empathy and kindness. And these are some of the things that you can witness taking place at different protests and demonstrations, is that people are showing a lot of empathy, compassion, and kindness because they understand the plight of anti-Blackness and how heavy a burden it is to bear. Neurogenesis is the when new positive experiences equals growth of new neural cells. So kind of helping to form new connections that are going to mend some of that damage to either brain function or memory function, or just kind of undo some of those hardwired experiences. Integration of prefrontal region through mindfulness, and the outcomes of that could be response flexibility, empathy, and morality. Again, things that being specific about your healing through service can bring, and the mindfulness strategies that they are attuned with. A pathway to integration, narrative memory and state integration. So taking unconscious memories and experiences and making them conscious. And oftentimes there's a lot of gaslighting that kind of goes on around racism and anti-blackness. And so using narrative memory and state integration can be very validating and affirming for people who are sufferers of anti-black racism. And these can also take place in the form of expressive arts, which is quite common at different protests and demonstrations, as well as in Black healing spaces. Also, there are many more integrations and aspects of consciousness that could serve as interventions, but these are just a few of them. I also wanted to present you all with some tangible examples of healing through service. The first being engagement in protest and demonstration, which provides space for groups to express collective pain, outrage, trauma, and sadness. It's one thing to feel like, you're going through something, but when you're in a space where everybody has had some idea, some level of consciousness about your trauma, it's different in that it's more affirming. And also, there's at protests and demonstrations, there's a lot of chanting, singing, and hopeful affirmations, which can be very therapeutic to sufferers of anti-Black racism. Another example is connection and affirming and healing spaces with community members. This picture is actually taken from sorry, my mind completely went blank. It was taken from a retreat of Black women who were seeking to heal from racial trauma, and specifically Black femme racialized trauma, which is heightened with the imposition of misogynoir and patriarchy. And then the last one being expressive arts, where people curate, express, and share art that speaks to the trauma, and it's not limited to performative or visual. And also, this list is the list of examples of how you can heal through service are not limited to these. We also talked about specific acts of service for the community, involving providing needs and resources for community members who are disenfranchised. These are my resources, but I quickly want to move into this video. See if it will open up. Okay. Don't judge the amount of tabs that I have open. Okay. Hopefully you